LS 600 hours, Strait of Hormuz, June 21, 2026, a day after the IRGC declared the waterway closed. Aboard the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Pinckney, the Aegis Combat System sweeps the 21-mile-wide chokepoint and returns a number that stops the watch officer cold. 5 commercial vessels. 5 tracked transits across a waterway that, before Operation Epic Fury reshaped this region in late February, averaged 130 merchant crossings every single day. An electronically signed peace memorandum is managed at Bergenstock. The mines do not care about paper. That gap, 130 ships reduced to 5, is not a diplomatic failure alone. It is a physical engineering problem, and the U.S. Navy's answer to it carries consequences that reach well beyond the Persian Gulf. The open question driving every shipping boardroom on June 22, 2026 is this: can the U.S. Navy physically reopen a choke point that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has turned into an active minefield, while simultaneously managing a ceasefire that fractured within 72 hours of its signing? The answer the Navy gives in the coming days will determine whether 20% of the world's oil supply moves again, or whether a piece of paper signed in Versailles and Tehran becomes the most expensive document in recent maritime history. Understanding what produced those 5 ships requires tracing the chain back to February 28, 2026, when a U.S.-Israeli coalition launched Operation Epic Fury. The air campaign targeted high-value military assets along the strait's northern coastline and opened what analysts now call the 2026 Iran War. Within 6 weeks, the strategic pressure translated into formal interdiction. On April 13, 2026, the U.S. Navy enforced a full maritime blockade, halting all vessels entering or departing Iranian ports. The economic architecture of that blockade was precise. According to claims by U.S. President Donald Trump, the Iranian economy absorbed losses of $500 million per day at the peak of the interdiction campaign, a rate that compressed Iranian negotiating space faster than ground operations could advance. That financial pressure did what artillery often cannot. It moved a delegation to the table. The compression worked, at least on paper. On June 17, 2026, envoys from both sides electronically signed an interim memorandum of understanding remotely, calling for the termination of the naval blockade and the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Markets interpreted the signing before naval assets could reposition. June 18, 2026, recorded 25 commercial vessel crossings, the highest single-day transit count since mid-April, as shipping operators dispatched vessels that had been anchored off Fujairah for weeks, reading the MOU as institutional authorization to proceed. The recovery looked credible. It lasted 48 hours. On June 20, 2026, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to all maritime traffic. The stated justification covered 2 points: ongoing Israeli military operations in Lebanon and what Iranian commanders characterized as documented U.S. ceasefire violations. Commercial operators, who had just repositioned vessels at considerable cost to take advantage of the reopening window, received those declarations through their maritime risk consultants within hours. If you want to stay informed about this critical geopolitical struggle and global shipping crisis, subscribe to our channel now and hit the bell icon for daily updates. Protection and indemnity clubs issued formal cancellation notices for war risk coverage in the region, while state-owned energy companies declared force majeure on shipping contracts. Within a single calendar day, the tracked transit count collapsed from 26 vessels to exactly 5. Not a slowdown, a near-total commercial halt. The physical reason those 5 remaining crews face a different problem than the political negotiators in Switzerland is buried in the seafloor. Intertanko assessments, cited in open-source analysis, estimate approximately 80 active naval mines deployed across the Central Traffic Separation Scheme, the designated inbound and outbound shipping lanes that tankers use to navigate the strait safely. These are not random placements. The Traffic Separation Scheme runs through the shallowest viable transit corridor, bounded by the Omani coastline to the south and Iranian territorial water limits to the north. A ship captain who deviates south to avoid the mined central lanes risks grounding on shoals in less than 15 meters of water. A captain who deviates north enters Iranian jurisdiction and risks seizure by IRGC fast attack craft. That geometry narrows the usable lane to a physical corridor roughly 4 nautical miles wide. Intertanko, the International Tanker Owners Association, warns publicly that professional mine-clearing operations across the central lanes will require months of sustained effort, not weeks, even under ideal conditions. U.S. Central Command, by contrast, tells a different story about what actually moves through the strait. On June 20, 2026, the same day the IRGC declared the waterway closed, CENTCOM reported 55 merchant ships carrying 17 million barrels of crude oil completed regional transits. That figure sits in direct conflict with commercial tracking data showing 26 vessels. The discrepancy is not an accident of data collection. It reflects the existence of a secondary escort corridor running close to the Omani coastline, separate from the mined Central Traffic Separation Scheme. U.S. Navy and coalition forces conduct a quiet, covert overwatch operation, digitally coordinating and guiding tankers that choose to proceed through this narrower lane. Those vessels transit with their automatic identification system transponders deactivated, what the maritime industry calls dark transits, which explains the gap between commercial tracking platforms reporting 5 ships and CENTCOM reporting 55. The AIS environment has deteriorated significantly beyond simple transponder deactivation, and the scale of the electronic disruption adds a layer of structural complexity that no diplomatic agreement can resolve in days. Marine tracking firms monitoring the strait in June 2026 have recorded over 200 commercial vessels simultaneously manipulating their GPS coordinates, broadcasting false position data to avoid advertising their location to potential threats along the Iranian coastline. This creates a dual-layer distortion. Shore-based commercial tracking systems show those ships in locations they do not occupy. Real-time radar aboard U.S. Navy destroyers, using Aegis sensor fusion across multiple frequency bands, cuts through the spoofed signals and builds an operationally accurate picture. But commercial intelligence services and Lloyd's of London underwriters cannot access Aegis data, which means insurance actuaries price risk against a distorted map. The result? War risk premium rates that push smaller shipping operators out of the market entirely, concentrating the remaining transit traffic among a handful of large tanker fleets willing to carry uninsured exposure on high-margin cargoes. Project Freedom, executed under the command of Admiral Brad Cooper at U.S. Central Command, addresses the armed threat layer sitting above the mines. In May 2026, MH-60 Seahawk helicopters operating under Project Freedom located and neutralized 6 IRGC fast attack craft that had positioned to threaten U.S.-flagged commercial vessels transiting the strait. Each of those fast attack craft, with missile-carrying variants displacing up to 200 tons and armed with C-802 anti-ship missiles capable of engaging targets at 80 kilometers, presents an asymmetric threat that a billion-dollar surface combatant cannot simply outrun or absorb while maintaining escort formation. The Seahawk response, aerial interdiction at close range, reflects a doctrine prioritizing speed of engagement over force mass. Neutralizing a 6-boat swarm with Rotary-Wing assets takes minutes. Repositioning a surface escort takes hours, and a 300,000-ton, very large crude carrier cannot maneuver at the speed that mine avoidance or fast attack evasion requires. The Project Freedom framework acknowledges that the physical limits of the tanker, not the capability of the warship, define the tactical ceiling. The Bergenstock resort in Switzerland, where high-stakes peace talks resumed on June 21, 2026, under mediation from Pakistan and Qatar, presents the diplomatic layer of the same engineering problem. U.S. President Donald Trump escalated pressure on Iranian negotiators directly during the summit, issuing a public warning that closing the Strait of Hormuz means you won't have a country, and threatening to impose unilateral U.S. tolls on all regional maritime traffic regardless of vessel flag or cargo destination. That toll threat lands with specific economic geometry. The U.S. draws none of its domestic energy supply from Hormuz transit, but every major Asian importing economy, China, Japan, South Korea, India, sources between 60 and 80% of its crude through this waterway. A U.S.-imposed toll regime would function as a secondary pressure mechanism, taxing competitor economies through their energy dependency, while the strait remains physically constrained by mines the U.S. Navy cannot clear overnight. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, leading the Iranian negotiating delegation at Bergenstock, responded by walking the entire Iranian team out of the talks in protest. His public statement made Tehran's position explicit. Iranian armed forces stand ready to neutralize any fresh U.S. military aggression, and the IRGC closure declaration remains in effect as long as Israeli operations continue in Lebanon. The walkout is tactically coherent from Iran's perspective. Every day, the strait registers 5 tracked transits instead of 130. The global energy price signal reinforces Iranian leverage. Brent crude and LNG spot prices move inversely to Hormuz throughput numbers, and the same choke point that cost Iran $500 million per day under U.S. interdiction now costs importing nations a proportionally escalating premium for every barrel that does not move through it. Leverage at a choke point runs in both directions. The demining problem sits at the operational center of any realistic reopening timeline, and the engineering arithmetic here is unforgiving. Mine countermeasures vessels are not fast warships. The U.S. Navy's Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships displace around 1,300 tons and operate at a maximum speed of 14 knots. Clearing a single confirmed mine using remotely operated vehicles and SLQ-48 mine neutralization systems requires between 2 and 4 hours per device, depending on water depth, bottom composition, and the mine's trigger type. 80 mines spread across a 4 nautical mile corridor represents a minimum clearing timeline measured in weeks under ideal conditions, meaning calm water, no active threat from IRGC fast attack craft, and cooperation from Iranian forces who know the precise location of each device. None of those conditions currently exist. Avenger-class ships conducting slow, precise clearance work require destroyer escorts to protect them from surface threats, which ties down combatants in a defensive posture rather than a power projection one. The mine threat is not a crisis that firepower resolves. It resolves through patience, precision, and time the energy markets may not grant. The Escort lane running close to the Omani coast is an engineering workaround, precise in concept but constrained by physics. It represents approximately 40% of the waterway's pre-war daily throughput by vessel count. The global energy system absorbs short-term reductions through strategic reserve releases and rerouted Atlantic Basin cargoes. But OPEC's surplus production capacity collapsed to nearly 0.03 million barrels per day across all member states, and International Energy Agency members are required to maintain a minimum of 90 days of net import coverage in strategic reserves, but actually average between 140 and 200-plus days. A multi-month mine-clearing operation consumes a substantial fraction of that buffer before the central traffic separation scheme reopens to unescorted commercial traffic. Any return to active military operations resets the clearing clock entirely, which is why the U.S. Navy's core strategic objective at this moment is not decisive military victory. It is duration management, maintaining enough throughput to prevent a price shock that triggers political responses from energy-dependent allies in Tokyo, Seoul, and New Delhi. The mine threat constrains physical throughput, regardless of what any memorandum states. The AIS spoofing environment degrades commercial tracking to the point where private capital prices risk at levels that exclude undercapitalized operators and concentrate convoy slots among state-backed tanker fleets. And the escort lane, while functional, represents a single corridor dependency that one successful IRGC engagement could close in under 90 seconds. A $50,000 drone boat detonating against the hull of a 300,000-ton very large crude carrier in the escort corridor would shut commercial transit more decisively than any diplomatic walkout. The engineering vulnerability of the workaround is identical to the political vulnerability of the memorandum. Both depend on the other side choosing not to act. The lesson Admiral Cooper's team at CENTCOM draws from Project Freedom reinforces doctrine that the Navy has carried since the 1980s tanker war. Physical control of the mine-clearing timeline transfers strategic leverage to whichever force holds it. Iran does not require a decisive naval engagement to achieve its objective. It needs the 80 devices in the central traffic separation scheme to remain in place long enough for economic pressure to shift the diplomatic calculus in Switzerland. The U.S. Navy's inverse objective is to move enough oil through the escort lane to demonstrate that the closure is functionally incomplete, sustain insurance market participation at levels above full withdrawal, and maintain Seahawk and destroyer presence sufficient to prevent IRGC fast attack swarms from targeting escorted convoys before mine clearance reaches a threshold that reopens the central corridor. 5 ships on June 21, 2026, against a pre-war baseline of 130. That ratio, roughly 4% of normal throughput in the visible commercial tracking layer, 13% in the CENTCOM-escorted dark transit layer, defines the precise distance between a signed memorandum and a reopened waterway. The distance is not measured in political goodwill or negotiating concessions. It is measured in mine countermeasure hours, Seahawk sorties, escort corridor capacity, and the number of tanker captains willing to transit a 2 nautical mile shipping lane where devices still rest on the bottom. The Bergenstock talks can produce language. They cannot produce the months of patient, dangerous, technically demanding clearance work that the Strait's central lanes now require before the next ship crosses without a naval escort at its shoulder.